Hello, you lovely ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mengs, and today I welcome you guys back to Unit Analysis, the series where we take a look at units from Advanced Wars in great detail. And today we are checking out the artillery. Probably one of the more controversial units, or polarizing units I should say, in Advanced Wars. People have very differing opinions on these, so depending on who you ask, you might get very different answers. I've heard pro players refer to them as utter trash, never worth building, and I've heard pro players call them amazing and some of the best cost-effective units in Advanced Wars. So why is this? What's the truth? Are they good or are they bad? Well, unlike tanks, who are kinda good all around, you know, no matter what kind of game you're playing, you're never gonna go wrong building a tank. But the artillery changes its function vastly depending on how you play Advanced Wars, whether you're playing with fog or not, whether you're playing on Advanced Wars by web or not. So we have to go over all these little things and talk about how the artillery differ depending on how you play Advanced Wars. But first, let's just go over its basics. This is the same regardless of what kind of game you're playing. I don't even believe the artillery changes that much from Advanced Wars 1 to 2 to Dual Strike. But the artillery is the earliest indirect unit you'll be able to afford. It is incredibly cheap at 6,000, so it costs a little bit less than a tank. However, every artillery that you build is a tank you're not going to have, so this is something you need to keep in mind. If your opponent is rushing out tanks at the beginning, you're going to be punished if you open up artillery. Now, the artillery, as I said, it doesn't cover a very large surface area. It is very dependent on stealth in Fog of War. Of course, the dream scenario is that a medium tank happens to wander within its range. You know, it only costs 6,000, and yet it is able to take half the health of a unit worth more than twice as much. So, if your artillery ever gets to shoot at a medium tank, then it immediately earns itself in. So that's the dream scenario. However, that's not very likely to happen. Most people will be a little bit careful about how they position their medium tanks in Fog. The artillery has a very nice supply of ammo. It has 9 shots, so it usually doesn't need to be resupplied by an APC. If an artillery is running out of ammo, that's a very good sign. That means the artillery has probably been very cost effective, so it's not something I would worry about. It does have a sort of low supply of fuel at 50, but this isn't usually a problem because the artillery isn't a unit that will move around a lot. I have noticed sometimes when going up against Drake with this fuel drain that my artillery are sometimes locked in place, but this isn't very common. The artillery isn't super mobile. It has 5 move, which is as much as the medium tank, and it moves on treads just like the medium tank, so it's pretty good at getting into forests, and that's a good thing because in Fog of War you're very dependent on hiding your artillery. In forests, that is usually what you want to do. But yeah, the artillery, I wouldn't call it super mobile, but it is at least more mobile than the rocket. It is a little bit more tougher than the rocket too. It tends to resist machine gun fire a little bit more as well. Now, let's talk a little bit about the different game modes that you're going to be playing on. So, if you're playing with Fog of War, as I said, the artillery becomes an ambush unit. You position it in a forests, and you're hoping that your opponent won't discover it and that they'll accidentally place a unit within its range, and suddenly the artillery becomes very devastating. However, this is very map dependent. If you're playing on a very small map with tons of forests and choke points, then the artillery becomes insane. However, if you're playing on Advanced Wars by Web, I have noticed that many competitive maps tend to be more open than not. There aren't many Advanced Wars by Web maps that have like tiny choke points, and they tend to be on the medium to larger scale, like this for example. And in this situation, if you're playing with fog off, then the artillery unit doesn't really become an ambush unit anymore because your opponent will see that it's coming. And in this case, the artillery becomes a zoning tool. Most of the time, your artillery will probably go an entire match without being able to shoot, but it can still be effective, because what you're essentially saying is, alright, you don't get to attack this area anymore. If you try to attack this area, you're gonna get shot by this artillery, so it can zone out medium tanks, and in some cases even neo tanks. And even in situations where your opponent is able to wall break you and break through an artillery and target the artillery in the back, it's still only worth 6,000. So is it really worth it if they're going to take retaliation fire? So the artillery is a very situational, and it's a very small range zoning tool, but it is a very cheap zoning tool. So again, it depends entirely on the map. However, not everyone plays Advanced Wars by Web. What if you play what I dub the hot seat mode? I mean, this is what I usually do when I stream with Panzergedov, is when we play on an emulator and we switch seats back and forth. Or, if you're going even more old school than that, passing a Game Boy Advance back and forth between your buddy. You know, the hot seat, the hot potato pass, whatever you want to call it. This is how I played Advanced Wars for most of my life. Now, why is this relevant? Well, when you're playing with this way, you can't see the enemy face. So the only thing you will see when you take your turn is, oh, one of my units disappeared. I don't know what killed it. Could have been a tank, could have been a rocket. I don't know. So if you're playing hot seat, or even more old school than that, a link cable. Actually, no, if you're playing the link cable, you can actually see enemy face. But if you're playing hot seat, indirects actually become, I would say, incredibly good, because when your opponent is not able to see the enemy face, then indirects just become insane. So yeah, I think depending on who you ask, if you're playing if you're asking like an Advanced Wars by Web pro player, or if you're playing someone who's more used to playing hot seat, you might get two very different answers. When you're playing Advanced Wars by Web, at least if you're paying attention, you will see a little Corsair show up on screen whenever you get attacked by indirects, so you will instantly know that an indirect is there somewhere. So you are only hiding your indirect until you take your first shot, whereas in hot seat, an artillery can actually sit in a forest and keep shooting for an entire game without being discovered once. So it's an insanely big distinction, actually. Now, another thing that is worth keeping in mind, if you're playing against the AI, or if you're actually playing with the link cable and you're allowed to see the enemy face, you definitely want to turn animations on when going up against artillery. And the reasons behind that is, during the animation, you can see where the artillery is shooting from. So here we can see, for example, if I was playing Max right now and it was the fog, I would see that the artillery shot came from a forests. So I know instinctively that the forests is where I need to search, because there are no other forests that would allow this artillery to shoot on the tank. Now, if I saw that the artillery was attacking from a road, now that would probably leave a couple more squares open for where the artillery would be. I would need to search all the road tiles. So this is something that, like whenever I go up against grid in the campaign, for example, always turn animations on, because it gives you additional information. So, another thing that makes the artillery very good are mountains. Mountains are fantastic for the artillery, and I have noticed that a lot of the maps on Advanced Wars by Web actually does feature a lot of mountains. That will allow you to position your artillery behind the mountains, and they can safely take shots from behind there. What I also like is that you can put infantry in the mountains to protect your artillery from mechs, and also get extra vision range, which is great. This is something I forgot to say when talking about the artillery's basics. It has a vision range of 1, so it is completely blind on its own. It cannot see anything on its own. It needs external support from a recon or an infantry in Fog of War. And of course, whenever you're shielding your artillery behind mountains, you do have to be wary of enemy mechs. If you're up against a CO like Sami or Adder, who can pop a movement increase, they can send their mechs over the mountains and do heavy damage to your artillery. So you have to be very careful about that. Another thing that I've noticed in Fog of War matches is whenever players make death balls, which is a very common strategy in Fog of War, it is when you clump your forces together into a little ball, and you move them in basically one giant unit. This is very popular to do in Fog of War, because it is just very hard to counter. Your opponent has to either throw everything they have at the death ball in an attempt to dismantle it, or they'll just be picked off. Trying to attack a death ball from multiple sides is usually not going to go too well for you, and in such a death ball, you can definitely position a few artillery. Because of course, when you have a large clump of units, it is kind of limited what units in that clump will be able to attack. But if you have artillery at the center of that unit, they'll be able to attack no matter what. So it really increases the potency of your death ball. But again, this is mostly something that happens in Fog of War. Death balls are not that common outside of Fog of War, because the enemy can see them coming. So yeah, artillery, very potent when at the center of a death ball. Now with that out of the way, let's go over and take a look at the artillery's basics, shall we? How they compare to various units. Artillery do actually do pretty nice damage, and here I've screwed up my vision, so that's really funny. Let me fix that real quick. Alright, there we go. Now I can actually see all the enemy targets I want to shoot at. So yeah, let's go through the units that the artillery can shoot at, and let's see how they perform, shall we? So against infantry, artillery deals 90% base damage. They're pretty good at interrupting captures if they're within range of a city. Infantry usually don't survive very long against them. Mechs are only slightly more resistant to artillery damage, taking 5% less at 85%. So mechs are also, you know, pretty bad against artillery. Mechs can also never go within the artillery, or they can never attack the artillery range without actually being attacked by it first, because mechs have a 2-move, so they always have to position themselves in range of the artillery in order to get it within striking distance, of course, unless you're playing a CO like Adder or Sami, that is. Artillery deals 80% damage against recons. Recons are a pretty good counter to artillery, at least if they can catch them out in the open. But if the artillery gets to shoot first, the recons will suffer pretty badly. Artillery do 70% damage to normal tanks. I would say that in most situations, tanks are pretty good at countering artillery. But again, you know, this is an indirect unit, so if it gets to shoot, it's pretty good. If it doesn't get to shoot, it's not very good. As we looked at earlier, the artillery does 45% base damage to the medium tank, so it is extremely cost-effective against medium tanks if it gets to shoot on the medium tank. And of course, the medium tank with its lower move and lower vision, I would say is a lot worse against the artillery, at least in Fog of War. Against neo-tanks, the artillery actually deals 40% base damage, so this is insanely cost-effective. This is a unit worth 22,000, so if you get your neo-tanks shot at by an artillery, you're in a very bad spot. Artillery deals 70% damage to APC, so they can never one-shot them even if they're out in the open. Not a very common engagement to take anyway. Against itself, the artillery does 75% damage, which is insanely high considering most mirror matchups are 55%. So, however, very rarely will you actually see artillery shoot at each other, unless of course you're playing Grit. Now, I am turning off CO abilities for these demonstrations, so these units aren't any better than normal ones. But I will say that one of the reasons why I think Grit is so incredibly strong in Advanced Wars 2 and Advanced Wars 1, like, he's really strong in all games, really, is solely because of artillery. Because he increases the range of artillery by 1, which means that he increases their surface area by an insane amount. And considering they're already so incredibly cost-effective, Grid artillery are just able to deal with pretty much everything. It's absolutely disgusting. Now, against rockets, artillery deals 80% damage, and this is actually something you might see sometimes. If you remember my match against Humpelman, I actually did move an artillery within minimum range of the rocket. So that means that with the proper positioning, you can actually zone out a rocket using an artillery if the artillery is able to move over to where the rocket is. Very rarely is it something you will see, but it did happen in my tournament match with Humpelman, so I guess you can make a small argument for artillery being able to counter rockets in some situations. Against anti-air, the artillery deals 75% damage. The anti-air will be able to damage the artillery pretty heavily back, though, if it gets to shoot first. Against missiles, it deals the same damage as with the rockets. They have the same survivability, 80% damage. Not really something you'll see a lot, but hey, there you go. Against battleships, the artillery deals 40%, which is as much as the Neo tank. So battleships on the surface seems pretty resistant to artillery fire, but then you have to keep in mind that this unit is worth 28,000, so this is not a good engagement. Cruisers take 65% damage from artillery. Again, cruisers are almost never built in competitive Advanced Wars, but here you go. Artillery deal 55% damage to landers, so landers actually are one of the most resistant ships in terms of taking artillery fire, only taking slightly less than the battleship, so that's pretty funny. And submarines, as long as they are not submerged, takes 60% damage. Of course, if you just send them under, artillery won't be able to damage them at all. So as you can see right here, for a unit worth 6,000, it sure deals a lot of damage to almost everything in the game. But of course, as we've already talked about, it is very situationally useful. Now let's have a look at the artillery's defenses, shall we? If infantry are able to close the distance and shoot at it, they will usually take a hit point off it, 15% base damage. So this is not something that I would consider very good in most situations, but you can reduce the potency of the artillery a little bit with infantry. Tanks do 70% damage to it, so if they close the distance, they will usually neutralize the artillery, making it pretty worthless. A 3 HP artillery isn't really going to threaten much of anything. Mechs do the same damage as tanks, doing 70% damage, but as we've already been over, the mech can never safely position themselves within the artillery's range before they get to strike, unless you have some kind of movement increasing power. Battlecopters do 65% damage to artillery. I would say battlecopters are a pretty good counter to indirects overall, because they're able to close the distance and bypass mountains. Neo-tanks just straight up one-shot artillery, 150% base damage. They can even do it on planes, so you're not going to be able to rely on artillery to safely protect you against a Neo-tank. Medium tanks do a little bit less, but they still one-shot artillery on roads at 105% base damage. If they're on planes, it is a bit of a coin flip whether they'll kill them or not. Anti-air deal a surprising amount of damage to anti-air, considering they use quote-unquote machine guns. So they deal 50% base damage to artillery. Bombers will do as much as medium tanks, 105%. They will just straight up one-shot artillery. Again, not something you'll see a lot, but it is nice when it happens. And I guess if a battleship happens to be on the field, which I don't understand why it would be, it deals, I didn't even see how much. I think, God, I actually missed that. You guys just rewind the video. Professional Manx right here. And as we've been over, as we've talked about multiple times about the recon can actually deal somewhat decent damage to the artillery. If the artillery is on a city, then the recon usually doesn't deal much. It will mostly just get repaired in on the next turn. So I wouldn't say the recon is like a hard counter to the artillery, but it certainly can poke it if it's out in the open. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say on artillery. There are, as I said, a very polarizing units. Some people love them, some people hate them. I just played a game on Advanced Wars by Web right now, actually, where I went up against Von Bolt in a high funds match, and that guy used, I might have to cast that game on my channel, actually, because he used artillery so well against me. He placed artillery everywhere. It was impossible for me to do anything. Now, of course, Von Bolt is a very annoying CO to go up against, but still, I would say that the artillery has a very high skill ceiling. It is a unit that, in the right hands, can do a lot if you're able to plan out your moves and think ahead and position them in such a way that where they can't be targeted. I would actually say, if you're a good player, they're probably better outside of Fog of War, just because you have the ability to plan out your moves perfectly and position them in such a way that they'll never get targeted, no matter what. So yeah, I think the artillery is a very good unit. I've had it used against me very effectively in the past, but I know that there are some pro players who call them trash and don't like using them. And if you're one of those players, I'd love to hear from you in the comment section. I'd love to hear what you think about the artillery, why you think it's a trash unit. I'd love to hear both sides, really. There's a lot of good discussion going on in these videos in the comment section. A lot of really good insight. Again, I wouldn't call myself like a super professional Advanced Wars player or anything. You know, I'm relatively mediocre. I've just played this game for a long ass time. But there are definitely people in the comment section who are a lot more well-versed in Advanced Wars than me, and I always love seeing those people come out during these videos and share their wisdom, because that's all I want to do, man. I just want everyone to become better at Advanced Wars, including myself. Anyway, guys, let me know what unit you would like to see me cover next in this series. We have been through quite a lot right now. We've been over the infantry, the mech, the recon, the tank. We've talked about the APC, now the artillery, the missiles, and the battlecopter, the cruiser, and also some air units as well. So we're starting actually to fill out the entire roster of Advanced Wars now. So anyway, if you thought this video was informative, smash that like button and we will call a Mogus at 3 AM. Okay, sorry, I will never do that. I will never become that YouTuber. Ever. Maybe. We'll see. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye-bye.